Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Jeremy, and thank you again for tuning in to the JP Tactical Gear channel. Today, I would like to bring you our third installment of Introduction to Firearms. Specifically, today we are talking about the anatomy of ammunition. So, let's get started. Now, all of your modern day manufactured ammunition is going to consist of four components. You will have a primer, you will have a powder, you will have a projectile, all of which are inside of a casing or a cartridge. Your primer consists of three separate components. You have what's known as a primer cap. It's basically just a covering on the rear of the primer. You have a small layer or thin layer of explosives underneath that cap. And then you have what's called an anvil. The easiest way I can explain this is it's a rock and a hard place. Your firing pin being the rock, the anvil being the hard place, the explosive between the two, when crushed, goes bang. Now, when the primer is struck, it ignites your powder charge. Now, the powder, contrary to popular belief, does not actually explode. It burns. And what happens when something burns, right? Like when you have wood on a fire and it's burning, it creates smoke. What is commonly referred to in enclosed systems as gas. This is where at a later date you'll hear us refer to firearms as gas operated. Not gasoline, but hot gases. So when the primer is struck and it ignites your powder, that powder burns, creating gases that have a larger expansion than the powder all by itself. This is what pushes the projectile out of the casing and down the barrel. Now, on the other side of your powder here, you do have your projectile. There's a multitude of different projectiles out there. You will note that I have marked full metal jacket and hollow point projectiles. Most modern day ammunition comes in those two flavors. A quick description of the way this works is you have a lead bullet that is encased in a harder jacketing, a harder exterior skin, if you will. And that's usually made out of copper. Now, there are some also that are bimetal, but the majority of them are going to be a copper jacketed. And this is where you'll hear full metal jacket, total metal jacket. This all refers to that lead projectile being encased in a harder layer. Now, when it comes to hollow point bullets, the hollow point bullet is still a jacketed projectile. Instead of having a football-like nose on it, it will actually have a hollow cavity in the front of the projectile. This is commonly your biggest difference between training ammunition as a full metal jacket cartridge or self-defense ammunition for us civilians as a hollow point projectile. Now, I'd like to dispel at least one myth while we're here, and that's that hollow point projectiles are designed to be more wounding or more violent than a standard projectile. That's not the case. Despite, I believe it's New Jersey, I could be wrong about that. It's either New Jersey or New York, hollow point bullets are actually outlawed because they've been deemed more aggressive or more violent, some rhetoric like that. What a hollow point projectile does is instead of having a football-shaped nose, it has a cavity in the front of the bullet. And the reason it has that cavity is allowed to fill with material once the projectile strikes something, and the projectile will actually open, or more accurately, bloom, very similar to that of a flower. And why do you want that? Why would you want that projectile to open up in the target? Well, it's very simple. If I take a sewing needle, and I smack it into my palm, it's probably going to go through my palm, right? But if I take a regular everyday number 2 pencil and smack it into my palm, it's not going to go through my palm, is it? What's the biggest difference between the two? One is significantly wider than the other. In this case, when you have a hollow point projectile expanding, creating more surface area, that transfers more of that projectile's kinetic energy into the target, both hitting the target harder, but also lowering the likelihood of that projectile traveling through the target or at least if it does travel through that target, it loses a majority of its kinetic energy. In other words, you might have a hollow point bullet and in a self-defense situation, it punches through the guy, but when it comes out the other side, it's significantly slower than if you just had a standard full metal jacket bullet that punched straight through and continued going. Again, these are broad strokes, but this is a basic understanding. Now, lastly, all of these components here are housed within your casing. The casing is usually made out of brass, however, there are steel and aluminum casings available out there. One thing I want to mention in relation to steel-cased ammunition, steel has a habit of rusting, where brass does not. So most of your steel-cased ammunition actually has some sort of preservative coating on the outside of the ammunition. This is where you'll hear terms like lacquer-coated ammunition or polymer-coated ammunition. That comes from the casing itself being covered in this coating to keep the casing from rusting. You see this a lot with like comm block ammunition, Russian ammunition, stuff from Eastern Europe, because they crank out large quantities of ammunition in steel casings because it's much more affordable than making them out of brass. Personally, as an experienced firearm owner, speaking to introductory students, I would say try to stick with brass cased ammunition. It tends to cycle better and it tends to be a little bit more reliable. Steel cased ammunition, because of those lacquer coatings, can actually end up leaving a little bit of that coating behind as each individual cartridge is fired, put in the chamber, fired and extracted, another one's loaded, fired and extracted. You get a little bit of that coating left behind each time, and eventually what ends up happening is you chamber around and then you go back to the gun a little while later after it's cooled, and you either can't get the gun open or you get the gun open and the cartridge is glued or stuck inside the chamber because of that leftover coating, and it can create problems. Again, broad strokes here, some guns will eat that stuff all day long, other guns can't stand it. Lastly, I want to talk about aluminum cased ammunition. I don't like aluminum cased ammunition. There's some people out there that say, oh, I run aluminum cased ammunition all day long and it doesn't bother my gun, I don't have any issues. To them, I say, good for you. Me personally, I just try to stay away from it. So in short, those are your four main components of ammunition. You've got your primer, your powder, your projectile, and your casing. Thank you again for tuning into the JP Tactical Gear channel. Again, if you want to support the channel, do all the standard YouTube things, hit the like button, subscribe, leave a comment. But if you'd really like to help us out, go to jptacticalgear.com and order yourself something. Whether you're in the market for an optic, whether you're in the market for a weapons light, or whether you're looking for some nylon gear, we'd be happy to help you with whatever you need. We only ask that you keep in mind, all of our nylon tactical gear is designed and manufactured in-house by yours truly right here in Las Vegas, Nevada. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again. Out.